So infrastructure as code is a way of us making or creating a declarative approach to the actual underlying infrastructures that we need. So we don't have to log on and physically one by one deploy services. We don't have to log on to AWS console and upload and manually create Lambda functions. We don't have to actually create step-by-step things like CI/CD pipelines. We don't have to create S3 buckets. We don't have to create SNS topics, etc., etc. We declare the whole of the infrastructure that we require through use of templating, CloudFormation. So we create a template
code.
So it's infrastructure as code is literally there is a coding language which is ultimately YAML, and we use YAML to declare resources in AWS, and we execute that CloudFormation template within AWS through the CloudFormation service, and CloudFormation then reads through our declared items that we want to deploy and deploys them for us.
So that could be anything in the entire AWS, well, almost anything in the entire AWS tech stack, right? So you need a server, you need a database, you need an API gateway, you need a Lambda.
Yeah, but more
defined as code.
Right, but more than that, we can declare the connections between those services.
Right.
So if we have, if we want to declare we need an S3 bucket, and if somebody puts some data into that S3 bucket, we want that data to be picked up, transformed with some code, some business logic, and outputted somewhere else, maybe to another S3 bucket. We can actually declare that entire process through infrastructure as code. We can declare that we want two buckets, an input bucket and an output bucket. We can declare that we need a Lambda function that processes data from files, for example, that have been put into the first bucket. But we can also declare that that Lambda function must be executed whenever there are changes into the first bucket. So we can.
So you can declare the code that's actually running on the Lambda itself. And
the connections between the different components.
Right. So what about security and things like, you know, that Lambda being able to execute that code and being able to access that bucket? Can that be handled with the infrastructure as code approach?
Yep. So identity and access management components are all declarable through the infrastructure as code deployments. So we can declare the S3 bucket, we can declare the access to who and what should have access to that S3 bucket, we can declare the Lambda function and the code for the Lambda function, we can declare the authorizations and roles that the Lambda function should use when it's performing its services. So we can limit the Lambda function to only what it needs to do and only what it needs to access. So that ties into the whole kind of security concept of not only do we have data that's secure in transit, data that's secure at rest, but also security around even our code and what can it do. So that the code itself, even if somebody would be to make a mistake in deploying the code or building the code and accidentally declare that it should do something beyond what it was intended to do, we can automatically lock that down through restrictions in the access management, so that the function itself is treated as an entity with roles and policies attached, so it can't do more than we originally designed.
So you're talking about templating not just the infrastructure, but the code running on the infrastructure, the security associated with it, the roles and you know, the interconnectivity between the entire, you know, your entire stack.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's the benefit then for us, the user, or even for our customers then?
Well, the benefits are pretty broad. So we've got the first off, and the most obvious one is deployment speed. So we can create templates that are reusable, and we can use them again and again and again, and make changes, make them better fit a customer's requirements. But we can leverage a templated approach. That means we're not starting from nothing with every new scenario that we meet. Every new business requirement doesn't require starting from scratch. So we get a speed advantage. We can not only, that speed advantage is also obtained then through the fact that we can make changes to our infrastructure really quickly. Because we're not having to log in to environments and change individual components, if something isn't quite the way that we want it to be, we can just simply edit the file, the YAML, that we used to initially declare all our resources and re-upload it and have AWS CloudFormation modify our landscape.
All right, so even being able to dynamically change the infrastructure, so is there a downtime for, if you're in a production environment and you're deploying changes to infrastructure and code, like what is the downtime in that sort of period of update? Like how long are we talking about?
Well, no real downtime. There'll be, there's a change, there's an amount of time it takes to implement the change across the landscape, but that's in the order of minutes. And that's even for quite a complex environment.
Right. Can we, just through those templates, is there any way to, for instance, if you're standing up a database, pre-populate that database with information?
Yeah, there is, and that's kind of a really interesting thing, and we love to do that sort of stuff. So we can create, initial deployments that will set up some initial containers, some initial data stores, S3 for example. So we can create an initial deployment that just sets up some initialization resources, data repositories, S3 buckets for example, and we can pause at that point, load some data into those S3 buckets, and then as we deploy the rest of the landscape, that rest of the landscape deployment can itself include things like Lambda functions that will run and go and seek data in those buckets, and take that data and load it into DynamoDB, for example. Commonly, one of the things that we do here is we'll create a pipeline, and as part of the creation of that pipeline, we'll create a managed Git repository, so code commit on AWS. And as part of the initialization of that CI/CD, we'll have a template that creates those initial resources. We'll stop at that point and load in a zip file with all of the content that we want deployed as part of our initial infrastructure. And that can be, if we imagine, that can be data sets, CSV files, things that will need to be processed. And then we can deploy the rest of the pipeline, and as part of that deployment, that initial commit, when we've created the Git repository, the initialization zip will be automatically imported into the commit, into the repo, and will be committed as the pipeline is being built. So we end up with a deployment that not only is the CI/CD pipeline, but also contains the very first deployment of our infrastructure, our target, with all the data that we need.